Hi, and welcome to this video on using AdminUI to create clients inside OpenIddict. My name is Kevin Jones. In this video, we'll take a look at how we can use AdminUI to create clients inside OpenIddict. And we'll also see how to create APIs that those clients are going to use. And to do this, we'll create two example clients. We'll create a machine-to-machine client and an interactive client. Now, having said that, there are certain things in this video that we are not going to show you. So for example, we are not going to show you how to write the complete application code for these clients. We'll just show you the code that we need to test that our setup inside OpenIddict has worked. So to do that, I'll show you how to add the code we need to interact with OpenIddict. I'm also not going to show you how to set up OpenIddict or how to set up AdminUI. There are other videos on this channel that show you how to do these things. Okay, so having said that, let's go and dive into some code. So this is the first application, and I created this from the .NET REST template. And this just gives us a basic weather application. Now I have made a couple of changes to this, and if I look at my NuGet packages, you'll see I've added a couple of packages. In particular, I've added the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Authentication JWT Bearer and OpenID Connect packages. And we'll need those in these applications that we have. I've also changed the launch settings. So I've changed the port that this application will run on. And it's going to run on port 5445. So with those in place, we can now add our authentication. And we do this in program.cs. So before the call to builder.build, we use builder.services and call add authentication. Now, when we add authentication to this application, we need to tell it which authentication scheme we're going to use. And as this is a REST API, we're going to use bearer tokens. And so the scheme name is bearer, but there's a constant defined for that. And that's defined in bearer defaults .authentication scheme. And if I hover over this, we'll see this is just a string, and it's the string with a value of bearer. Now with that in place, I need to configure the bearer scheme. So we call add bearer. This takes a lambda, and in that lambda, we can configure the options for this bearer scheme. So for that, I need to set three options. I need to set the authority, and this is the URL for OpenIddict, which in our case will be localhost port 5003. We also need to set the audience. Now we haven't created this yet, but we will in a moment inside OpenIddict, and we'll call it weather_API. And then finally, we'd like to verify that we are getting the correct type of token. And we do that by saying options.tokenValidationParameters.validTypes. And this is an array of string, and the value I want to pass into here is AT plus JWT. And this is the standard type for our JOT token. Now we've configured this, but we haven't added it to the pipeline yet. So to do that, we call app.useAuthentication. And when you add this call, make sure you add it before the call to use authorization. And then I need to make sure that we have a secure endpoint. So if I look inside my weather forecast controller, notice that I've added the authorize attribute to the controller. So every endpoint on this controller requires authorization, i.e. I need to get a token before I can use this endpoint. Okay, so with that in place, we can now go and configure this application inside AdminUI. So why use AdminUI? Well, you could update the OpenIddict database by hand. But if you do that, there are many tables to change, and it would be easy to get this wrong. It would be hard to find mistakes. So AdminUI provides a user interface to this database, and it's easy to use. And it also helps us enforce industry best practice. So let's go and see how we can use it. So AdminUI is an application written by Rock Solid Knowledge, and we can use this to manage our identity application. In this case, we are using it to manage OpenIddict. In a previous video on this channel, I showed how we can use Rock-Solid Knowledge's Quick Start to set up both OpenIddict and AdminUI. And that's the version of AdminUI I'm using here. So this was previously installed on my system. Now I'm going to use this to set up these applications. So to do that, we log in. And then once we've logged in, we can use the UI here to set up various things. Now, AdminUI has this idea of an API, and it's the API that we are going to protect. So to do that, the first thing I do is go to Applications, APIs, and I add an API. And the API we are protecting is our weather API. So we can call that weather_API. We give this a display name, and let's call it weather API. And we can create a secret for this, although in this case, we don't need to. If we go next, and next again, and then we can save this API into the database. Now, by creating this API, we've also added a scope, and this gets added automatically. And this scope is called weather_API. Now, once we have the API, we can then add a client that wants to use that API. So again, if I go to Applications, Clients, click on Add Client. Now, the first client we're going to create is a machine-to-machine client. So I'm going to have the REST service running, and then I'm going to hit that REST service from some other application. So with no human involvement, if you like, typically. So to do that, we click on Machine, we go Next, we give the client an ID, and in this case, I'm just going to call it M2M. And we also give this a display name, so we can easily identify this client. So let's call this one Weather API Client. Go Next. We need to give this client a secret, and in this case, I'll just use the super secret word secret as the secret. Go Next again, and then we need to assign scopes to this client application. And the scope that we want is the Weather API scope. So let me assign that scope, and go Next again, and we are done. And we can now save this client. And again, this gets written to the database managed by OpenIddict. So with that in place, let me run this Weather API application. Now this runs on port 5445, and it has a Swagger endpoint so we can see the APIs here. Now to use this, I can send a GET request to this endpoint. So we click on Try It Out here and then Execute. Notice we get back a 401 error. So we need to be authenticated to hit the endpoint. So to be authenticated, I need to get a bearer token. Now, in the second part of this video, I'll show how to do that from an MVC application. But just to show this working, I'm going to use curl as a client to this application and show how we get a token and how we use that token to get to this endpoint. So to get the token, the first thing I need to do is to send a post request to OpenIddict. So we send the post request to localhost 5003, and notice the endpoint is /connect/token. So if it can, this endpoint will generate a token for me and return it to my client. So notice the client ID is M2M, and the scope is Weather API. And we set the client secret to be secret. So if I run this, then this returns me an access token. And I can grab that access token and take a look at it. So if we go to the jwt.io website, this lets me decode a token so I can see what's inside it. So here, if I paste that token in, we can see what's inside this token. Notice we have the audience of weather_API and a scope of weather_API. And I can use this token to call this endpoint. And again, I'm going to use curl to do that. So in this case, we use a GET request. We set the authorization header, and this authorization header takes a bearer token. So we say bearer, and then we copy in the token we just got back from the token endpoint. And notice we send in the request to localhost port 5445 and the weather forecast endpoint. That's our client. So if I run this, we get back the data. So we see here we get back some weather information from that endpoint. So it looks like we've configured this endpoint correctly inside OpenIddict using AdminUI. Okay, now you're not going to sit there and type in cool commands to get back this data. Instead, we're going to use some front-end application. So let's go and see what that application looks like and how we configure that using AdminUI. So we've seen how to add a machine-to-machine client, but typically we'll also have an interactive client, which indeed may call an API. So what I'd like to show you now is how to add that interactive client and add the correct scopes to it so that it can use our weather API. So in AdminUI, we're at the client screen. And from here, again, we can do add client. Now this time it's going to be a web application. So we choose that, click on next. We give the client an ID. And in this case, I'm simply going to call it interactive. And we give this a display name. And it doesn't particularly matter what this is, but let's say weather MVC application. And go next. Now the client and OpenIddict will interact. And OpenIddict needs to call the client to send it some information. And so we have to set this callback URL. And that's going to be HTTPS localhost, the port the client is running on, which is 5444, followed by the callback endpoint. And the callback endpoint is set up by the OIDC middleware, and it defaults to sign-in-OIDC. You can change this when you configure the middleware, but you don't have to. And typically it's left as that value. Now there's also a logout endpoint. And that again has a default value, which in this case is sign-out-OIDC. We then go next, and we can then assign scopes that our application wants to use. So we can add things like, for example, the user profile scope. But what we really want here is the weather API scope, as this MVC application is going to use the weather API application. So we can add both of those, go next, check that everything is okay, and save the application. So before we go and look at the application code, I need to change one more thing here. If I go into the weather MVC application and go to security, I need to add a client secret. And again, I'll just call this secret. Now, this does not have to be the same as the secret for the API application. And in fact, it should probably be different. I'm just being very lazy here. So we can update that value and then make sure we save those changes. So with that in place, let's go and take a look at the MVC application. So this is in the same solution that the weather API was in. It's just a separate project. If we look at the launch settings here, we can see the URL for this application is HTTPS localhost port 5444. And if you remember, I used that to set up the callback endpoint for OIDC. We tagged /signin-OIDC on the end of that URL. We also, in this application, need to configure OIDC. And I've set the values for that in appsettings.json. So again, we have the authority URL, and that's the URL for OpenIddict. Our client ID is interactive. We set our client secret to be secret. And then remember, this application, this MVC application, will make use of the weather API application. So we need to set the scopes that we're going to use, and that's the weather API scope. So these values are in appsettings.json, and these are used inside program.cs to initialize OIDC. So again, we call builder.services.addAuthentication. We have a different scheme now. So the default scheme is cookie, and we're going to use cookies to remember details about our authentication. Inside here, we set the authority, the client ID, and the secret, and we add the scope. And that all comes from the appsettings.json. We set the response type to code to make sure that we are using the authorization code flow, and we set use PKCE to be true. PKCE stands for Proof Key for Code Exchange, and it adds an extra layer of security into OIDC when we get our tokens back. And if we look back inside AdminUI at the weather MVC application and look at the token request tab, we can see this requires PKCE, and that's enabled by default. So back in my code, this application only has one controller, and that's the home controller. And this controller calls the weather API, and that's this call to client.getAsync to the weather forecast endpoint. Now we know that when we call this weather forecast endpoint, we need to attach a bearer token to make sure we authenticate correctly. When I run this application, it's going to ask me to log in. When I log in, it's going to give me back two tokens, an identity token and an access token. And that access token is what's used as the bearer token. To get hold of that access token, we call getTokenAsync, asking for the access token. We then set that token as the bearer token, and then we can make a call. So let's try this. So if I run the weather MVC application, it's going to start and listen on port 5444. Now, I'm running this in incognito mode just to make sure there are no stale cookies lying around that could interfere with this demonstration. Now, if I look back in the code, we can see I've marked this weather endpoint with the authorized attribute, which means that when I browse this endpoint, I need to authenticate. Back in the browser, if I go to /home/weather, it's going to ask me to authenticate. And to authenticate, it redirects me to OpenIddict. So from here, I can type in my username, which is kevin@rocksolidknowledge.com, and then my password. Once I have that, it takes me to the consent screen. So it's saying to me, do you want to grant the weather MVC application access to these scopes? And notice in particular, it's asking if I want to be allowed access to the weather API scope. If I click on yes, that will come back to the application. The application then turns around and calls the REST service and gets the data back from the REST service. And when it calls the REST service, it takes the access token and attaches that token as a bearer token. So for my MVC application to call the weather API, we have to make sure we set this token. So in this video, we saw how to set up two projects with AdminUI on OpenIddict, an interactive client and a machine-to-machine client. I hope you found this useful, and the code for those projects can be found here.